Hello and welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. We are continuing our discussion on innovation by examining telecommunications and ICT-related conformity and interoperability, CNI, in the Caribbean. Participating in the discussion is Dr. Cathy-Ann Radix, lecturer in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. Through the university, Dr. Radix has been involved in the effort to develop the conformity and interoperability framework for telecommunications and ICT products across the region. So in this episode, we will be discussing, among other things, the state of CNI in the Caribbean and the work that has been done to date to advance that framework in the region, her thoughts on innovation in the region, and whether there is a link between CNI and innovation. Doc, welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk about this topic with you today.
Okay, so to just get us started, can you just explain to our listeners what is meant by the terms conformity and interoperability and why they are important?
Well, in our context, we use those words to talk about whether or not equipment meets certain established standards. So when we're talking about conformity, or sometimes you'll see the word conformance, what we're checking to see is how well your product or system conforms to certain requirements that have been documented and specified in a standard. That may be a national standard, or it may just be an agreed standard from a particular organization. So conformity is important if you want to make a product that you claim meets a particular standard. Sometimes there are national standards to which you must conform before you're allowed to use your product in that country. So where there are national standards, conformity is an issue because you cannot use, import, or sell your product without demonstrating conclusively to the relevant agencies that you have conformed with their standards. Interoperability is related. The challenge with interoperability is when you have multiple systems that need to talk to each other or operate with information that was generated from each other, then they must all have a common framework. So interoperability is about ensuring that your device is consistent with that common framework, thereby enabled to communicate with other devices of a similar type. So, for example, we might be talking about making a Bluetooth device. So if it doesn't conform to the Bluetooth standard, then it won't be able to operate with other Bluetooth devices. So they're almost two sides of the same coin.
Understood. And I think as you're saying these things, I gather that is going to become increasingly important, especially when we have discussions about Internet of Things and machine-to-machine communication and the like.
Yes, that is, I believe that is the niche that we need to be particularly concerned about, simply because there is both the opportunity to develop such devices within the region and the need for such devices within the region. So whether we bring them in or we design and build them here, we need to be concerned about the issues of conformity and interoperability when it comes to these devices.
Understood. And I have some more questions on that, but I'll hold off on it. And let's just kind of go back through some of the developments that have happened over the years, starting with the baseline study, which was conducted probably about 5 years ago on the state of conformity and interoperability with respect to telecommunications and ICT products in the region. What were some of the key findings?
Well, I think that original baseline study was very instructive for me personally. And I know that is when I first met you and started to interact with you, because you were also working on that baseline study.
Yes.
The key findings for me coming out of that were that, firstly, the dominant practice in the region is that we do not presently routinely carry out conformity and interoperability testing. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen at all. It just that's not the routine procedure. Typically, people who wish to bring a product into the region would provide test reports from a jurisdiction that is outside of the region, and permission will be granted to import that product on the basis of those test reports that were generated for another jurisdiction. And sometimes the process devolves to admitting the goods on the basis that it has already been approved for an extra regional jurisdiction. In principle, there is nothing wrong with that practice. I think all our relevant stakeholders are being responsible in following that practice. The challenge comes when people send goods that do not meet the test reports. And at this time, we have no way of catching that. I think we need to be practical about the realities in which we live, which is that it's difficult for all the relevant agencies to test every single product. So that is one real reality. The second real reality that we must face, though, and this is one that all the surveyed stakeholders acknowledged, was that with the Internet of Things, the range of devices that they are being asked to screen is exponentially increasing.
All right.
And so the problem is getting more significant with time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that those were the key findings, that we do not presently screen as a routine. And secondly, that we should be concerned because we're seeing increasing requests for a wider range of devices to enter the region.
Okay. So, as you've said, that many of the countries currently rely upon certifications that have been issued by other countries or having test results prepared in other countries and using that as a basis to facilitate the importation of certain devices and products into specific countries in the region. So why do you think, though? I mean, it works relatively well. I gather, though, the only challenge might be that if a product has not been tested, we may not be able to allow it to be imported. So why do you think that a case has been made and it probably is still being made for the Caribbean region to develop its own CNI framework or develop more its CNI framework?
Well, the current practice assumes that we are consuming technology that was made somewhere else and has already been tested for use in that other jurisdiction. That is what it assumes. So the challenge we face is that if we want to be developers of technology, and that is an if, then we need to acknowledge that what we are asking our developers to do is to have their products certified in another jurisdiction before it can be used in their own jurisdiction. And that is clearly a little bit of a contradiction.
Yes.
Especially when some of the products that we would like to make are really tailored to our needs and would not be suitable for use in the jurisdictions to which we might seek to send it. So I think we need to think carefully about what we would like to achieve in terms of development of technological products. Because if the purpose is for us to leverage technology to address our own needs, then it seems a little contrary to require the developer to certify that product in another jurisdiction before they can use it in their own jurisdiction. That is, it doesn't line up in my head. Not to mention that there's a cost associated with the testing, which is a further hindrance.
Definitely. But I mean, here it is that if we were considering, for example, having equipment tested in the region and or even having bodies in the region that can certify products or accredit organizations, all of this is expensive and might not be cost effective based on the actual number of products that might need to be tested or certified, etc. So are there ways, I mean, that the region could approach CNI that could make it not only just cost effective, but sustainable?
I think that is an excellent question. And I think that is the question that we are now trying to grapple with. What is an appropriate model that we can use to acknowledge the fact that it is impossible for us to provide all services within the region, but also acknowledge that there is a need for some kind of accommodation for such devices. because I don't think anyone is of the opinion that we should simply allow locally developed devices to 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 operate without any form of testing or assurance. That clearly is not appropriate. So we clearly need to find a middle position. Last year, the ITU facilitated a stakeholder session, which brought developers, regulators, and policymakers into the same space. That was a useful initiative in that I don't want to say that it forced, but it brought to the forefront the fact that the differing opinions need to reach a compromise point. And one of the ideas that was floated was the idea of a sandbox model, where a reduced level of testing requirements would be put in place for locally developed products for a finite time. So this would not last indefinitely. And the intent was to allow developers to deploy in small quantities a product that they would need to test in the field. And once the product had proven itself successful, then they would have the leverage they needed to seek financing for testing in labs elsewhere. I want to be clear, though, that even if you send your product for testing in an extra jurisdictional lab, the region can still specify which tests need to be performed so that we could further minimize the costs associated with the testing by being very specific about which tests we need performed. Perhaps we don't need to perform the entire suite that another jurisdiction requires. Perhaps we could be specific about which tests we require. So I think with those two positions, local pre-compliance testing for some basic assurance for a limited time, followed by a specific suite of tests that we require for locally developed products, even if those tests are carried out in extra jurisdictional labs. I think the combination of those two, or some combination thereof, is an appropriate solution for us. But the details have to be worked out. That idea is not yet a year old, and it came out of the joint conversations of all three stakeholder groups.
Well, that's excellent. And certainly, gives me hope. I just hope that we don't lose momentum and, 5 years from now, we're ready to dust off that idea yet again and not necessarily just keep advancing the effort.
I think you are correct in being concerned, because that is one of the challenges we face with many different issues in the region. We are resource constrained, we are personnel constrained, and if it's not urgent, it gets put on the back burner. One of the most interesting things I observed in that meeting of the three stakeholder groups was that the developer community at the beginning of the event was the most averse to having to meet any conformity or interoperability testing.
Interesting.
In their view at that time, the additional time and effort that would be required to undertake a full suite of CNI testing would make it difficult for them to ever finish and deploy anything. And however, throughout the workshop, by the end, they recognized that by judicious use of the practices of pre-compliance testing, they could in fact produce a more robust product, which was more likely to operate correctly over a longer period of time. And from that perspective, they then started asking, well, what can we do?
Right.
What should we have? Where should we go? Because they could see a benefit to their own community. So I think if this needs to move forward, it clearly needs to be driven by the developer community, who see a need because it would help them to improve their product.
Understood. Yeah, and I do hope that at least they keep their eyes on this and do what needs to be done to try to get the necessary framework put in place to facilitate it, because it would just be a shame. Talk to me about this developer community. I mean, was it relatively substantial? Was it just one or two people? What is the sense as to the scope of innovation, or the amount of innovation that is happening within the region? Or certainly, was it regional, the event that you had, or just
It was regional. It
Okay.
was.
Okay.
So So the three communities. So we had policy and governmental agents. We had the developers, and then we had regulators, all together in one space. And we had regulators from several CARICOM territories, developers from at least two, if not three, CARICOM territories, and policymakers from at least three CARICOM territories. So we had a range of perspectives. I think, and as the host of the ICT podcast, you will know that over the last maybe 10 years, we've had a lot of software hackathons taking place within the region.
Yes.
There's been a lot of focus on creating, whether it is web-based apps or cell phone-based apps, to meet the needs of the region. And I think coming out of that initiative, we're now starting to see that some of the apps actually require some specialist hardware or a dedicated hardware device. It's not enough to run it on your phone or on your computer. You actually need a box. I'm going to use the word box here for want of a better word. You actually need to run it on a box.
Right.
So that the developers who are developing solutions for needs where they need a box have been using a variety of off-the-shelf products. Some ones that people may have heard of would be things like Raspberry Pis or Arduinos. And so they're using these embedded computer boards to power their solution. Now, these boards are not certified. So, and further, once you include the board in a product, you should, in principle, recertify them. Now, given that the developer community has developed out of the software development community, they are not aware of these legislative constraints. So their first reaction then to it being brought to their attention was, well, this is a difficult thing to do for us, because the principle in the software community is pretty much the saying is suck it and see. You know, you try, you rapid prototype, you develop rapidly until you find something that meets the needs of your customer.
Right.
And then you look to monetize at that point. So that if we put on a requirement that they have to do this upfront certification, which requires time, effort, and money, that interrupts their rapid prototype development cycle. So really, from their perspective, they don't want to invest that time, effort, and money until they are sure they have a minimum viable proposition. Yes. So I think that from that perspective, it's almost a keep back to them. So given that our hackathons have identified that, yes, we do have these needs, and yes, we are capable of developing software solutions to meet those needs. Now that we're moving into the territory where it's not a software solution, it's an integrated solution that requires a box, we need to be cognizant of the fact that that now leads to a whole new set of issues for developers. And I think the juxtaposition of those issues that the developers are facing with the fact that the regulators and policymakers are recognizing that the proliferation of such devices raises new issues for conformance and interoperability, I think we're in a sweet spot for dealing with these issues.
Excellent. Yes, I think we'll see what happens. But clearly, since the developers, I gather, seems to be a more developed community. The numbers are greater, as you said, coming out of all of these hackathons and so on. So there may be within that community almost a critical mass to help to drive the process forward.
Especially if we can demonstrate to them conclusively that they will make better products if they perform these actions.
And as you rightfully said, I mean, in many instances, it's no longer just an app. You want the program to do something within a box or to interface with something else.
Yes.
Okay, so Doc, I understand that you're involved in quite a bit of research and development of what I understand could be viable ICT products. Can you share with us some of those projects or products?
Well, I can share with you a few that I am aware of that colleagues of mine are undertaking at the department in which I work. We've got a range of activities going on. Some of which require communications and some of which don't, but all of them require a box, an embedded box. So I suppose the most well-known one is probably the PHY, which is an electronic steel pan, which is controlled using an embedded box. They have recently gotten CNI clearance. On the route to CNI clearance, they did have some interference issues which actually affected the quality of the sound of the pan itself. And those were resolved through conformance and interoperability testing. We also have a variety of monitoring systems for weather and natural conditions. So we have colleagues who are doing flood monitoring. We have seismic monitoring. We have traffic monitoring. All of these monitoring systems are distributed. So they typically require some kind of communication backbone to get the information back to a central location or up to the cloud. So those would involve Wi-Fi, maybe mobile data, mesh networks. The next category I would say that I know people are looking at would be, I have a colleague who's working on systems for nearshore fisherfolk so that we can track marine conditions and also provide an alert facility. That is looking at what we can use to provide that nearshore facility. Now, there are guidelines for small scale fishers, which state that they should all be equipped with VHF radio, which would provide the primary alert mechanism.
Right.
However, that does not allow for automatic marine condition tracking. And we must acknowledge that while in some territories it is mandatory for you to carry a VHF radio, it is not so in all regional territories. So that there is a need to come up with some sort of regional solution to help with that. And I have a colleague who's working on that. And lastly, I have colleagues who are working on post-disaster communications. How do we enable communications in quick time after a disaster? And the disaster could be hurricane, volcano, eruption, earthquake, flood. So post-disaster communication strategies is something that people are working on, and that necessarily would involve some kind of communication infrastructure on a box. So those are just 4 areas in which people are working on. These are very specific regional needs that may be shared by other small island developing states, but it's unlikely that they would be shared by what we call the developed countries in the Northern Hemisphere. So I think that there's room for us to be cognizant of the fact that these are products to help ourselves.
And as you said, I think many of them may require a box. So there has to be, hardware. So there has to be some way of ensuring that there is some conformance to standards. And even in the example that you gave about the electronic steel pan, that there had been some interference issues that had to be addressed.
Yes, it did. And in fact, that particular product is intended for international sale. So clearly, they would need to get that clearance at some point as part of their development strategy and trajectory. But the question is when? Should they need to have it before they can sell within Trinidad? Should they need to have it before they can sell within the region? That is the question that we face. At the moment, the answer is yes. The question is whether that's reasonable. Now, for the electronic steel pan, it is a device where you could potentially have large sales. But for devices that cost a fraction of that, it's difficult to recoup the costs of testing.
And just going back to that electronic steel pan, or even for many of these systems that are being developed and researched at this point in time, I'm even thinking that even if they were to have large scale application, global application, at least you would almost want to beta test it in the region, before you.
I think that's it. Before you send it elsewhere. That is a fair point.
And therefore, having some, CNI done on the products at some point in time before they are released to the local market or the regional market is more than reasonable. You don't necessarily want to be doing testing internationally, whether at the FCC or the EU, for a product that may need some finessing if when people start to interact with it, when you could probably have done a lot of that, locally or regionally, and end up with a more robust product before it is marketed globally.
Precisely. I think that is the key aspect. And recognize that whilst it is possible to get permission on a per case basis to sell or deploy your products before it has received that international test report, a per case basis is not really encouraging the sector to move forward, because that means that every individual product has to seek permission on a per case basis. And at this point in time, we don't have a streamlined process for individual cases to apply for that type of approval. So even if all we did was streamline the process for exceptions, then that would be helpful to developers.
Understood. Okay, so just moving forward, what are your thoughts about ICT and tech innovation in Trinidad and Tobago, and even in the wider Caribbean?
I'm happy to see that it is occurring. I'm happy to see that we are giving it value. I think the three key issues when I think about ICT and tech innovation. One is that a lot of us don't believe that we can do it. And I think the more products that we have, the more that people see that we can do it, the more self-belief that our young people have in themselves, the more of these types of applications that we're going to see. I think, once it hits a critical mass, it's going to take off. And we need to be prepared to work with that. We can't wait until after it's taken off to put systems in place to manage it. I also think that it's key that we meet our own needs versus having someone else meet those needs for us. So one of the criticisms that is sometimes leveled at the sector is that, someone from China could make it cheaper, which is true.
Yes.
And that is a reality. But perhaps we want to prototype and decide exactly what we want before we get somebody from China to make it cheaper. And furthermore, when the person from China makes it cheaper, how do we assure ourselves that they're making it to the quality standard that we require?
Mm-hmm.
So, we still need to have the expertise within the region to question and ask those types of things. So I think it's important. I'm happy to see that it is moving. I think it will have a direct impact on the way in which we conduct our own business. I know that often people tout it as a way for the Caribbean to earn foreign exchange. I'm not sure that that's where I want to start. I think I want to start with meeting our own needs first, and then look at how we can meet other people's needs with the same services afterwards. But it may potentially become lucrative in the long term. But I think in the short to medium term, we need to look at meeting our own needs. And I think we're becoming a lot more deliberate about our efforts to do so.
Understood. Do you think that the region should focus on ICT innovation and the building of electronic products and these devices in a serious way? The reason why I'm asking is that, as you rightfully said, we have, I think, traditionally focused on software development, but the actual building and maybe even to the point of manufacturing our products is something that I think we think is too expensive, and therefore I think we have shied away from it. What are your thoughts?
I think there's a real reality that there is economies, an economy of scale. So for a first level deployment prototype, you may not want to build customized hardware. So I take that point. However, the reality is that once you want to go into serious production, you have to deal with the fact that the embedded boards that we buy off the shelf really cannot cope with the salt exposure, for example, in the Fisherman's Project. It can't deal with the heat because our temperatures are a lot higher than the places where these devices were originally designed to operate. The UV exposure is another one we have to think about. So in the long term, it's not possible to use off-the-shelf embedded boards.
Right.
They're a good starting place, but in the long term, it's not sustainable for any product that needs to be in the field en masse for more than a year. So I think that realistically, if these are needs that we are trying to meet that require the box to be out in the field for a sustained period of time, then we do need to start looking at designing the products and devices in a serious way. Whether we build them, I think we may need to take a strategic approach. Maybe we build the capacity to build them in small scale, and then we get them built somewhere else that could build them en masse and cheaper once we are clear about our design goals.
Right.
And that is a standard manufacturing strategy. So there's nothing unusual about that, except that I think that by keeping the design within the region, we retain the expertise, and we also give ourselves the ability to really tailor it to our needs.
Definitely. And I think my final question is, do you think ICT and tech innovation is being hampered in the Caribbean due to the absence of a more developed CNI framework? So whether it the test laboratories or even the proposal that you were suggesting with the pre-compliance testing, etc. Do you think that that ICT tech innovation is being hampered due to the absence of a more developed framework, CNI framework?
I think so, because as I said, the developers were not aware that this could make their product more robust. So simply from the fact that they could make a better product and they are not aware because there is no framework and there's no education about what such a framework might entail, then that means they are necessarily making products that are not as robust as they could be. So I would say that is one key observation. The other is that it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, because I am concerned, and this is a concern. This may never happen, but I am concerned that when we hit the critical mass and suddenly we have all of these devices trying to do various things to meet various needs on all kinds of boxes, none of which have been certified, that out of necessity, policymakers and regulators may take a draconian approach. They may simply have to lock the entire sector down to get a handle on the problem. And we've seen something similar to this happen in some territories where they have, for example, banned the importation of drones across the board because they were not in a position to have any kind of regulatory framework to monitor, police, or approve any particular drone device. And if such a thing were to happen for embedded boards, that would completely stifle the market. So I think we need to be ahead of it. We need to have a position and an approach before the critical mass arrives, because simply saying don't do it, apart from encouraging people to try and subvert the existing regulations, it's going to keep us from meeting our own needs with our own locally developed solutions. So I think it's twofold. One, the products could be more robust if there was such a framework. And two, when the critical mass comes, we need to be prepared. Otherwise, we're just going to revert to, in my opinion, we'll just revert to blocking everything. And I don't think that would be productive. What I'm hoping is that I'm wrong, and that the very proactive policymakers and regulators will see the need to be in front of the wave.
Absolutely. And on that note, thank you so much, Cathy, for joining us and shedding some light on CNI. I'm quite concerned that if the region does not move to address this issue, that the whole industry that is being nurtured and people coming out of university with all of these brilliant ideas will ultimately, the ecosystem will get throttled, and we will not be in a position to really leverage all of the resources and capacity that we have within the region. However, I do feel as if we're leaving on a positive note, and I'm looking forward for what will come.
Well, I think that it is a positive place to be. I think that now that the issue has been ventilated and the three stakeholder groups have come together and they have all agreed that no one wants to see the sector throttled, that we should get a framework in place within a timely manner, in a timely fashion. And I look forward to participating and supporting those efforts in any way that I can.
Excellent. So thanks again for joining us.
And thank you for having me. You have a great day.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.